Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to my channel. It is Friday. Happy Friday. So, today was the last day of Cassie's cross-examination. And y'all, Diddy's defense team really did their job. A lot of people didn't get why they kept focusing so much on the text messages between Cassie and Diddy. But today, it all made sense. Oh my gosh, they completely pulled the rug out from under Cassie's swollen pregnant feet. You guys, let's just get straight into these transcripts. This video is just a transcript of what Cassie said during her cross-examination. No commentary from me. I'll be breaking down her entire testimony in another video, so stay tuned for that. But for now, here's the transcript. The judge says the government has said the defense's cross-examination can go until 4:30 p.m. today, and they'll limit themselves to 30 minutes of redirect. Diddy's lawyer, as Navajo says, we have evidentiary issues. The judge says, tell me about them, should have been in writing. As Navajo says, we don't understand why they are taking time objecting to our exhibits. Prosecutor Johnson says they are proposing to use a video of Mr. Combs walking in nature talking about God. It is improper. Invited jury nullification. The judge says, let's hear it. They play it. Diddy speaking about God. As Navajo says, this was about him being in rehab, which Ms. Ventura didn't remember, so we want to refresh her recollection with this. Prosecutor Johnson says it cannot be played for her in front of the jury. As Navajo says, we have headphones. The judge says our jury is ready. Any more issues? As Navajo says, if the rape is after the charged conduct, it shouldn't have come in. It's a huge issue for us. The judge says it's not a huge issue. You didn't raise it at the time. As Navajo says, we thought we could cross-examine on it. The judge says, all rise, good morning. You are still under oath, Ms. Ventura. As Navajo says, you believe Mr. Combs was blacked out for the intercontinental event? Cassie says, I believe he was intoxicated. Everyone's definition is different. As Navajo says, but you said blackout. As Navajo says, what did you write here? Cassie says, I wrote, when you get effed up the wrong way, you always want to show me that you have the power and you knock me around. I am not a rag doll. I'm someone's child. As Navajo says, when he get effed up the wrong way, you meant drugs? Cassie says, and alcohol. As Navajo says, here, Mr. Combs writes to you, I am so horny for you. Prosecutor Johnson says this is not evidence. As Navajo says, here, Mr. Combs is asking you for sex soon after the intercontinental incident, right? Cassie says, I was saying who he felt. As Navajo says, what did you write back? Cassie says, I wrote, we need a different vibe than Friday at the Intercontinental. As Navajo says, Mr. Combs wrote, F Friday. I don't even want to do that again. What did you write? Cassie says, I wrote, LOL, true. As Navajo says, Mr. Combs suspected you of having an affair with someone else in the industry. What happened? When he took your phone. Cassie says, we were in a car and he told me to call my mother. When I did, he grabbed my phone and took off. As Navajo says, it was a big fight. Cassie says, he was just gone. As Navajo says, for how long? Cassie says, a few hours until my mother called the police. As Navajo says, did Mr. Combs go through your phone? Cassie says, I think so, and he called someone on it. As Navajo says, the person you had an affair with? An NFL player? Cassie says, I don't know if he's playing it anymore. Estavajo says, but he was an NFL player. And Diddy was jealous. Estavajo says, wasn't there a time he found out you were dancing with another person in the entertainment industry and took your phone, right? Cassie says, I don't remember. Estavajo says, it was Chris Brown. Cassie says, I was not dancing with him. Estavajo says, look at this. It's from 2013. Cassie says, now I see. Estavajo says, what else did Mr. Combs take? Cassie says, my car, my passport, when he was angry. Estavajo says, let's refresh you about Mr. Combs being in rehab. Cassie says, I vaguely remember. Estavajo says, why did you go to Sedona? Cassie says, I went to Arizona to get away from the drugs. Estavajo says, I'm going to go to a new topic. Mr. Combs told you to go get the video you heard about. What did you write? Cassie says, I wrote, you keep putting me down. Estavajo says, I'm going to play you some audio. In the audio, Cassie is saying, if you saw a video of someone effing me, who was effing me? You have it. Why didn't you show me? And the guy says, because I'm not disrespectful, bro. Cassie says, if you don't show me, I will unalive you, cut you up. Still the audio play for the jury. Cassie says, I will effing unalive you. I've never unalived anyone in my life. I am going to F you up. It's not going to be blood on my hands. Someone else is going to do it. I'm not playing with you. Tell me. Estavajo says, that was you, right? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, did Mr. Combs express concern about these videos being released? Cassie says, when? Estavajo says, ever. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, the escort Jonathan Odie, you thought he took a video. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, Mr. Combs spent a lot of money to make sure the video did not get released. Cassie says, I don't know. Estavajo says, you had a conversation with Jonathan Odie that was transcribed. Cassie says, I'm not sure. Estavajo says, he was volatile. Cassie says, I don't trust him. Estavajo says, what did Mr. Combs say when you told him you thought Mr. Odie was recording? Cassie says, he said he would take care of it. Estavajo says, are you aware of an escort leaving comments on Mr. Combs' Instagram page? Cassie says, I am not aware. Estavajo says, now, let's talk about rehab. Do you still use Suboxone? Cassie says something like that. Estavajo says, what does it treat? Cassie says, opioid addiction. Prosecutor Johnson says, objection. The judge says, overrule. Estavajo says, you wrote a book in rehab. The place treats sexual compulsion. Prosecutor Johnson says, objection. The judge says, sidebar. And then they came back. Estavajo says, did you get neurofeedback therapy? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, what is it? Cassie says, they hook something up to your head and show you things, see how you react. Estavajo says, were you told the effects of it? Cassie says, help me with my trauma. Estavajo says, did you participate in EMDR? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, what does it do? Cassie says, memories and processing them. Estavajo says, the idea is you recall prior traumatic memories, like for PTSD. You were being treated for PTSD? Cassie says, yes. Cassie says, I was still physically developing. Estavajo says, you were 22. Cassie says, women keep developing after 22, don't you think? Estavajo says, but you're not suggesting you were still physically developing after 22. Cassie says, I'm not. Estavajo says this message is about having a freak off without ketamine, right? Prosecutor Johnson says, may I conference with counsel? The judge says no, but we'll take a break. Jury leaves. Once the jury left, the judge says witness list by Sunday, 5 p.m. As for these long text messages, use binders so we can save time. Now we will break. And then they came back. Estavajo says, Mr. Combs wrote, you are so predictable. You've said you were going to tell him you didn't want to freak off anymore, but you didn't say it, did you? Cassie says, I did not. Estavajo says, here, you were suggesting freak off with a girl. Estavajo says, you say you found a photo of Mr. Combs with Gina while you were staying with your parents in Connecticut, right? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says you decided to break up with him and he didn't threaten you, but suggested couples counseling. Cassie says, I don't know. Estavajo says in August 2018, you called it a closure conversation. Mr. Combs was inviting you to Burning Man, right? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, I read Mr. Combs. You have anger. Cassie says, I wrote. My family knows. I am not running around telling our business. Cassie says, I wrote, I don't need you to be taking care of Kim and Gina. I need you to put me first. Estavajo says, please read these. Cassie says, I wrote, you lied to me. She never went away. It was the nail in the coffin. Estavajo says, you met Gina, the photo. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, in your civil lawsuit, you say Mr. Combs raped you in September 2018 after you had dinner at an Italian restaurant in Malibu, right? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, did you meet with the government on November 30th, 2023? Cassie says, yes. Not the exact date. Estavajo says, in this meeting, you said the rape took place after Mr. Combs returned from Burning Man. You said he was acting strangely at that dinner. Cassie says, I don't remember exactly that word. Estavajo says, did you meet the government on April 8, 2025? Cassie says, around then. Estavajo says, this message to FB, who is that? Cassie says, Frank Black, a name Diddy used. Estavajo says, Diddy wrote, I'm in an investors conference. We'll get back to this. You still have love for him? Cassie says, I have love for the past and what it was. After yet another sidebar, Estavajo says, you wrote, I didn't mean to be a bitch. I just don't get the time. And Diddy writes, just need you to be positive, correct? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, DX1309. This is about a yoga instructor. Cassie says, yep. Estavajo says, what did you write? Cassie says, I wrote, I've stopped even caring. Estavajo says, but you did care. Cassie says, yeah. Estavajo says, so he said you could date other people. Let's just talk about it, correct? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, what did you write? Cassie says, I wrote, I do love you. I would just prefer not being one of your girlfriends. Let's get up tomorrow night. I'll do studio from 6 to 9. Estavajo says, he writes, can I hold you? Or are you just going to break up with me? Estavajo says, and you write back, we can embrace, LOL. And you wanted to hug him, right? Cassie says, that's what I said. Estavajo says, did you have sexual intercourse with Mr. Combs that night? Cassie says, I did. Estavajo says, in doing that, your now husband FaceTimed you. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, your now husband didn't know you were with Mr. Combs at the time. Cassie says, I don't know what he knew. Estavajo says, later he discovered it. Prosecutor Johnson says, objection. The judge says, overrule. Estavajo says, you didn't tell your husband you were raped? Cassie says, not that evening. Estavajo says, after Miss Porter's memorial service, you wrote to Diddy that you were going home. And why did he call Kim his soulmate? What was the 11 years all about? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, that was hurtful. Cassie says, at that time, yes. Estavajo says, and after that memorial service, you never saw Mr. Combs again, right? Cassie says, I did not. Estavajo says, he let you go, right? Cassie says, I never saw him again. I don't know about letting me go. Estavajo says, you got married to the love of your life, right? Then they took a break. The judge says, let's get this done before the jury returns. Estavajo says, we still think it's appropriate for this message to come in. Prosecutor Johnson says we still have issues with phrases like, I would like to reconnect. A little side note, after Kim's funeral, Diddy texted Cassie saying he's gonna fall back. And she could reach out to him if she needs him. And Cassie wrote, I am lost without you. Okay? So back to the transcript. So Prosecutor Johnson says we still have issues with phrases like I would like to reconnect. What state of mind is this being offered for? The judge says there are portions that are properly admissible, so this needs to be redacted if it is going to be admitted into evidence. But for example, in the 5th paragraph, I've been getting my life together. No. Estavajo says, we can get that in through other exhibits. The judge says, you can redact it right now. Estavajo says, I will do it right now. Estavajo says, I want to say we are going to finish with cross-examination faster than we thought, probably before the next break. Agnifilo says, may I speak with the government for 1 minute? The judge says, bring the jury back. Jury enters. Estavajo says, Miss Ventura, we are almost done here. Cassie says, thank you. Estavajo says, I will read Mr. Combs' message. You are going to make a beautiful mother. God bless. Cassie says, I said thank you. God bless. Cassie says, I wrote, we should talk and have closure. Estavajo says, Mr. Combs sent back a tear face emoji. He said, you were always my ride or die. Cassie says, I thought it was nice. Estavajo says, you had been craving that. Cassie says, before, I don't think I was craving now. Estavajo says, you shaped you over 11 years. Silence. Estavajo says, you shaped each other. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, your husband's a physical trainer. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, the house you grew up in Connecticut was relatively modest compared to the mansions. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, you were preparing to tour with Matt Testa. Cassie says, yes. He's an engineer. Estavajo says, once you settle your lawsuit, you cancel the tour, right? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, because you no longer needed the money. Cassie says that wasn't the reason. Estavajo says, after the hotel video came out, you posted on Instagram that domestic violence is the issue, right? Cassie says, yes, I still feel that way. Estavajo says, DX1015, Mr. Combs wrote, do you want to freak off one last time? What did you write? Cassie says, I wrote, I don't want it to be the last time. I want freak off for the first time. Estavajo says, no further questions. Then the judge says, redirect. Then the prosecutor, Johnson, says, Ms. Ventura, you were shown this message where you ended, I don't want to freak off for the last time. I want it to be the first time for the rest of our lives. What did you say after that? Cassie says, I said, yes, I'm horny. Just got over a UTI. By the way, a UTI is urinary tract infection, okay? So Cassie says, yes, I'm horny. I just got over a UTI. Johnson says, you were shown messages today in which you and Sean were kind and loving. Cassie says, yes. Johnson says, did those period ever last? Estavajo says, objection. The judge says, overruled. Cassie says, no, didn't last. There's a downswing. Johnson says, what world did Sean open up to you? Cassie says, a world of chaos. Johnson says, in your 11-year relationship, who did you want to have sex with? Cassie says, only him at that time. Johnson says, when Sean wrote, seduce me all day, what did you do? I read about freak-offs. Johnson says, were you able to cancel work obligations for freak-offs? Cassie says, yes, if I was told to. Johnson says, when you were shooting the movie in South Africa and you blocked him, how did he contact you? Cassie says, through Mia. Johnson says, he said he didn't remember hurting you. Did you believe him? Cassie says, not always, because I knew him. There were times he was pretty aware of what he was doing. It's just who he was. I had seen him be violent with other people. Johnson says, on the way back from Cane's, what did Sean do? Cassie says he played a video of me having sex with an escort. Johnson says, what did he say he would do? Cassie says he would release it. Johnson says, when you got to NY, what did Sean ask for? Cassie says a freak-off, or he would release it. Johnson says, when Sean wrote, you ready for tonight, what did he mean? Cassie says freak-off. Johnson says, what were you afraid he would do if you did not do the freak-off? Estavajo says, objection. The judge says, overruled. Cassie says, I don't know that week. The judge says, next question. Johnson says, do you have any doubt that Sean raped you? Estavajo says, objection. The judge says, overruled. Cassie says, I have no doubt. Johnson says, after Sean raped you on August 18, did you later have consensual sex with Sean, during which your now husband FaceTimed you? Cassie says, yes. Johnson says, why did you cancel the tour? Cassie says, after I filed my civil suit, I was overwhelmed. Addressing the past the way that I chose to was overwhelming. I didn't want to go. Johnson says, do you plan to file more lawsuits? Cassie says, no. Johnson says, would you give the $20 million back if you hadn't have had to do freak-offs? Estavajo says, objection. The judge says, overrule. Cassie says, I would give it back to get my agency back. Johnson says, did he beat you doing freak-offs? Cassie says yes and starts to cry. Johnson says, were you open to freak-offs at the beginning? Cassie says, at the beginning, yes. Johnson says, did you tell him when you no longer wanted to do them? Cassie says, yes, more than once. Johnson says, what concerns did you have about saying no to freak-offs? Cassie says, safety, career, love. Johnson says, no further questions. The judge says, Miss Estavajo? Estavajo says, you knew Mr. Combs' sexual preference was these freak-offs, right? Cassie says, I learned. Estavajo says, it was part of being his girlfriend. Cassie says, yeah. Estavajo says, you kept your old device. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, and freak-off videos in this case, they were all on those devices you kept from 2012 and 2014. Cassie says, I don't know what year. Estavajo says, you were able to stand at his side at the Met Gala. Being his girlfriend gave you access to producers. Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, beyond Kid Cudi, what other musicians were you put in the studio with? Were you put in the studio with Nicki Minaj? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, you were put in the studio with Lil Wayne? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, and with Rick Ross and Pusha T? Am I forgetting any names? Cassie says, you've got a lot of names. Estavajo says, you are self-conscious about your musical talent. Cassie says, I wouldn't say that. Estavajo says, you had a bad performance on 106 & Park. Cassie says, early in my career. Estavajo says, you did music videos. Were they successful? The judge says, may we have a brief sidebar? They had a sidebar and came back. Estavajo says, D-Rock was like a member of your family? Cassie says, yes, like a brother. Estavajo says, the assistant Mia you also had a friendship with? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, here you began with an explicit message, and he responds with one, you are actively sexting. Estavajo says, you stated that you were feeling overwhelmed after filing your civil lawsuit, right? Cassie says, yes. Estavajo says, you recently received a settlement from the Intercontinental. Cassie says, no. Estavajo says, you made a demand. Cassie says, yes. 10 million, maybe. The judge says, anything further? Then the prosecutor Johnson says, I just have one question. The judge says, I was asking Miss Estavajo, can you wrap up in 2 minutes? Estavajo says, this is the last thing I'll ask you to read, Miss Ventura. Cassie says, thank you. And I wrote, we need closure and understanding. Then Prosecutor Johnson stepped up. Johnson says, why did you keep your devices? Cassie says, I was afraid of what was on them. I wouldn't take them to the Apple store. Estavajo says, one question. You just reached 10 million settlement with Intercontinental last week before the trial. Johnson says, objection. The judge says, overrule. Cassie says, yes. And this was it, you guys. This was Cassie's cross-examination. Well, her last cross-examination. All right, word for word. So let me know what you think. Because, yeah, stay tuned for more videos and commentary. Because I have a lot to say about her cross-examination. The whole thing, really. All right, so stay tuned for that. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications so you don't miss any updates. And I will see you on the next one. Peace.